Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and I'm here once again in collaboration with Chip Theory Games to bring you a Gearloc guide. And today's Gearloc is Polaris. She's one of the Gearlocs who was released alongside the Unbreakable expansion, and she is very, very interesting to play. She's a geologist who has a number of interesting abilities that are controlled by these orbs, which we're going to talk about extensively throughout the video. But first, we've gathered all of Polaris' stuff. We have her Gearloc mat, we have her dice, we have her chip, we have her orbs, so you should have 4 purple orbs and 1 yellow orb. And she also has 2 different reference sheets for her as a Gearloc. So this first one is just her normal Gearloc reference sheet. It's the same size as everybody else's. It looks basically the same. And she also has this extra one called Delve Deep with Polaris. There's something special she can do with her mineralist profession that we're going to talk about later in the video. So I'm going to put this aside for now, but you're definitely going to want this if you're reading along with me as I teach how to play Polaris. I've also, of course, got a lovely battle mat out, and it's the one from Unbreakable, looking lava-tastic. So as usual, Polaris has all of her stats up in the top left corner of her mat. She has 4 different professions, as well as a couple of consumables that we're going to discuss. She's a melee fighter, although she does, with her orbs, have the ability to do some long-distance damage, which we are going to talk about. And she has her innate and innate plus 1 abilities. Her innate is called Attraction Specialist, and her innate plus 1 is called Matchmaker. So Attraction Specialist basically consists of her ability to use orbs. She's going to start with 2 dice on her mat. One is Iron Orb, which is basically her innate ability to place orbs. So die number 1 is going to start right here in slot 1 on her Gearloc mat. You've also got Seeking Stones, which is a consumable that she uses. It's also a counter. So it's going to start on her mat as well, set to 0. But we're going to talk, of course, about how to increase it. And so as part of Polaris' innate abilities, she is able to place her orbs here in her trajectory board. And the spots here on the trajectory board look confusing, but if you check out these 16 spaces here, you might notice they look a little bit like the 16 spaces on the battle mat. And then these little extra spots on the sides are from Undertow. So she can also be integrated into Undertow. And the main thing with her is making sure that you are playing from a position where you can look at your trajectory board, look at the battle mat, and see the correspondence between the different spots. So you want to be able to look at this position and know that it matches with that position. So what's very interesting about this trajectory board is that as you place orbs on it, orbs can basically be anywhere, which is super cool. The only thing an orb can't share a spot with is another orb. They are able to move onto and through battle map positions that are occupied by other units. They can move into unoccupiable positions in the board, like holes. There's basically nothing that can stop them. The one thing to really note about them is that when they move orthogonally. They do not move diagonally. So I can move my orbs orthogonally in ways that correspond to spots on the battle map. So how do you deploy orbs? You do this with the Orb Sage profession. An Iron Orb is the first die in that profession. So we're going to talk about the specific die faces in a bit, but the main thing that you need to know is that whenever Polaris places a die from this profession, and that can be in the backup plan, it can be in an active slot, it can be in a locked slot, anytime she places the die in one of these slots on her mat, then she also gets to place an orb. And where she can place an orb is limited by where she is, basically. So if I'm here on the battle mat, then I can place an orb where I am, or I can place an orb in an adjacent space to where I currently am. If all of the orbs are already out for one reason or another, then Polaris cannot deploy more orbs. So basically these purple orbs are the ones that she can deploy through her Orb Sage profession. This yellow orb or gold orb is connected to the extra orb consumable. So this one's a different color because it can only be deployed in a certain way. And that's with the extra orb die. Polaris is also able to recall orbs on the mat, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to actually talk about it as we hit the skills and backup plan options that cause recall. However, one basic thing to know is that at the beginning of the game, when Polaris recalls orbs using her minor and major recall skills in her backup plan, she recalls all of the orbs that are on the trajectory board, regardless of whether she actually wanted to or not. Once she hits her innate plus 1 ability, which is called Matchmaker, that changes. Then when she uses either the minor or major recalls from her backup plan, Polaris can choose which orbs are recalled instead of recalling all of them. So she will eventually get some more control over that as long as you upgrade her to innate plus 1. We're also going to talk very briefly about Seeking Stones. We'll discuss what it does later, but you should know that it has a lot to do with her orbs and that you can increase it in 2 ways, one through the backup plan and one through the Fortune Discovery loot card. So this is a resource that you're going to have to build up and manage very carefully. So with that, let's actually talk about Polaris's dice, because I think that talking about the orbs in the abstract gets a little bit confusing. I think it's much better to look at them in detail. So I want to talk first about Polaris's Orb Sage profession, which starts with Iron Orb. Again, this is the profession that allows her to place orbs in the first place. So basically every time she puts a die from her Orb Sage profession into a backup plan, an active slot, or a lock slot, at that time she's able to deploy an orb at or adjacent to her current position on the battle mat. And you reflect that here on the trajectory board. So let's also look at what these die faces do and then have some demos. So here we have Iron Orb, which of course has a couple of bones faces. This is, after all, too many bones. It's also got a lovely little active slot die called Recycle. And this is basically a die face that lets you keep orbs in play. So you have to have orbs out to fully enjoy it. But basically, if you have orbs out on the trajectory board and you recall them, then you can exhaust this die from active slot to immediately deploy an orb. So basically, when you recall orbs, they do whatever they're going to do. They go back into your prep area. They leave the battle mat. So after you do a recall, if you exhaust this die from an active slot, then you can put an orb right back out there in the action. We have Magnetic Pull. This is also an active slot die, and you exhaust it to move any unit that's adjacent to an available orb position onto that orb position. So I'm going to show it to you in a moment. You also have Magnetic Push, and this one you exhaust to move any unit that is on an orb position by one position. So let's see what those mean. So just for the sake of example, let's say that Polaris has been here, that she has deployed an orb here. So that means that this orb was deployed adjacent to her, and it's also in a position that's adjacent to the bridge troll. So let's also say, for the sake of example, that I have rolled Magnetic Pull and that it's sitting up here in an active slot. What I could do is I can exhaust this die and move any unit that is adjacent to an available orb position onto that orb position. So that means that I can essentially use the fact that I've exhausted this magnetic die to pull the bridge troll into this adjacent orb position, and then I can hit him or whatever it was I intended to do. So that's Magnetic Pull. Let's say that this is where the bridge troll was, and instead I have Magnetic Push in an active slot. That means I can exhaust it to move any unit that's on an orb position by one position. So I could exhaust this die. This unit is on this orb position, and I can use Magnetic Push to push him to any of these adjacent positions. So essentially, because the bridge troll is on an orb space, I can manipulate that bridge troll further. So again, a lot of playing Polaris is making sure that you're very positionally aware of what orbs are out and what is on those corresponding positions on the battle mat. And that is Iron Orb. So let's have a look at some of the other orb abilities. We've got Nickel Orb and then Cobalt Orb. They do some similar things with some more snazzy effects. So let's take a look at Nickel Orb first. So as expected, there is a Bones face on here. There is a Recycle face on here. And again, if you recall an orb, you can exhaust this die if it's in an active slot to immediately just get another orb back out there. It has a couple of Magnetic Push sides. And it also has some new stuff. So the first new thing is called Heavy Orbs. And basically what this one means is during orb recalls, you may move each unit touched by an orb one position. This is a locked die face, and it lasts the entire adventure unless you choose to unlock it. But we're going to talk about that in a moment when I show you some demos. We've also got Floating Orbs. This is another lockable face. So during your movement phase, you may move an orb on an occupied position to an adjacent occupied position as many times as you wish. And this also lasts the entire adventure. So let's have a look at what these new faces do, because I think that once you see what they do, you can see their use, but they can be a little confusing at first. So first, let's say that I've rolled and locked Heavy Orbs, because why not? You'll notice that Polaris only has one locked die slot and a bunch of different locked die options, so you're going to have to kind of think about that with her. It can be very frustrating, but in a good way, because there's a lot of stuff you might want to lock, and you can only lock one thing at a time, so you're going to have to make some decisions there. But Heavy Orbs lets you move each unit touched by an orb by one position during a recall. So what is a recall? Let's actually demo how it works here, because I feel like that is the best way to teach it. So let's say that this is our current setup on the battle map for one reason or another, and that there's an orb here. So on the trajectory board in a place that corresponds to this position. There are a number of ways that Polaris can recall an orb, but let's say that she's going to do a minor recall from her backup plan. This one lets you recall all orbs to your position, and they do some damage to everything they touch. 2 damage to each baddie, 1 damage to each party member. But we're not going to worry too much about that right now because we're going to talk about the backup plan later. The main idea is that she's doing a recall. And you can read about recall details here under critical Polaris details. But essentially what a recall does is it recalls all orbs that are currently on the battle mat back to Polaris by the shortest route possible. And if you do have her in 8+1, then you can choose which orbs come back, but we're going to assume for now that she's not at that stage and just all the orbs will return. This is also a good place to note that Polaris is not affected by recalled orbs. She is immune to them because she controls them, and also that an orb that damages units can only damage each unit 1 time only during a recall. So if she does a recall action and she has heavy orbs in the lock slot, that means that it's going to come back to her by the shortest possible route. So it'll pass through these positions and then go back into the supply. But as it did that, it's going to pass through 2 positions that contain baddies, but this would also actually apply to Gearloc units as well. So as it moves through positions that contain units, you're able to move those units by 1 on the way back to Polaris. So basically that means that when Polaris moves orbs and the heavy orb's face is up in her lock slot, it gives her the option to rearrange the units that it touches on the way back. And you don't have to move each unit. It says you may move each unit touched by an orb by 1 position. But that's helpful because maybe you want to get somebody away from you. Maybe you want to tactically do some resetting, and this die is going to let you do that. The other thing to note just for fun is that if we have this setup, the obvious shortest route to Polaris is here. But let's say that the orb is in this location. You get to choose the route that the orb takes. So if you wanted to, you could go 1, 2, 3, 4 back to Polaris and touch no one. Or you could go 1, 2, 3, 4 back to Polaris. It's the same distance and you affect some different chips. So recalls go along the shortest route back to Polaris and orbs only move orthogonally. But you do get to make a choice if there's more than 1 equidistant route for the orb to take during a recall. So that's heavy orbs. And you've also got floating orbs, which we talked about. So this one means during your movement phase, you can move an orb on an occupied position to an adjacent occupied position as many times as you wish. So let's say that Polaris is here and maybe she's just put an orb down that is next to her, but she wants to kind of maybe move it down the row, maybe to recall it and do some more damage. So you could do something like use floating orbs to push an orb away from you and then recall it, pull it back, and make sure that it touches more baddies to hurt them, or that it just impacts more units depending on what you're doing. So with floating orbs, what I could do during my movement phase is move an orb on an occupied position. This position is occupied to an adjacent occupied position. So I could move the orb here because this is occupied, but then I couldn't move it any further because this position is not occupied. But you can do this as many times as you wish, which means that if there is a chain of units along the battle mat and you want to push your orb around, you can use them almost as like a life chain that the orb can pass through to go to a different location, which is very useful because when Polaris places an orb, she can only place it on herself or on an adjacent spot. So if you want to kind of throw an orb across the mat, having something like floating orbs is nice because you can use the presence of other units to make the orb move. So those are all of the faces on Nickel Orb. And then let's have a look at Cobalt Orb. So Cobalt Orb is the 3rd and final die in the Orb Sage profession. And as usual, it does have a bones face. It does have a recycle face. So now that you've seen a recall, as you know, when you recall an orb, it goes back to your supply. If you have this in an active slot and you play it, the orb can go back out at or adjacent to Polaris, which is getting it back into the action. There's 1 magnetic push side. There's 1 magnetic pull side. And then there's a different lockable option, which is this lovely set of hands with like a little orb floating above them. This stands for orb support. So this is another option for your lock slot. At the start of your turn, you gain +1 dex and +1 attack that turn for each orb position that you are adjacent to. And this also lasts for the entire adventure. So let's have a quick look at it. All right, so let's say that, Polaris has been really good about getting some orbs out, and she's managed to deploy one here and deploy one here, and so she's adjacent to 2 different orbs. That would mean that at the start of Polaris' turn, since this orb support die is in the lock slot, she gets +1 dex and +1 attack for each orb position she's adjacent to. So that'd be +2 dex and +2 attack at the start of that turn, because she is adjacent to 2 orb positions. And that is how orb support works. So those are the dice that are in Polaris's Orb Sage profession, and these are the dice that let her put orbs out onto the mat. So again, there's only two ways to get orbs. You roll dice from this profession and you put them in the backup active or lock slots, or you use the extra orb consumable to get the yellow one out. So Polaris's orbs are very powerful, but you have to be strategic about how you get them out there because it's actually pretty tough to deploy them, and you can't just spew orbs all over the place because you have to train these dice to get more than just iron orb, and you also have to be using your dex to roll them, etc., in order to get the orbs out into action. But that is Polaris's Orb Sage profession. So let's go ahead and talk next about Wellness Guru, which is hilarious. I feel like Polaris is both a geology and an astrology girl. So this middle profession we're going to ignore until later, but we're going to talk about this red Wellness Guru profession first. So there are two places you can start with it. You can start with Healing Aura or with Negative Vibes. And you are traveling towards Orbital Strike from either of these directions. So you can go Healing Aura, Natural Empath, Orbital Strike, or you can go Negative Vibes, Orb Apothecary, Orbital Strike. So let's go ahead and just do our star spaces. We'll do Natural Empath and Orb Apothecary, and then we'll go to the middle where they meet. So first we have Healing Aura, that's die number 10. And this die does have one bones face, but it also has a lot of these convenient little test tube faces, and what this stands for is supplement. And so what this means is that each orb on a Gearloc position gains the number of buff HP that's printed on the die face. So of these faces, one has 1 buff HP, and then there are 2 faces with 2 buff HP. But don't forget, just as baddies can be on an orb position, a Gearloc can be as well. So if a Gearloc is on an orb position, you can use supplement to give them some buff HP. You've also got Fortify, so each unit on an orb position gains a defense 2 die. So this doesn't say each Gearloc, note. This one says each unit, so that means that a baddie or a Gearloc that is on this position will get a defense die. So be careful when you play this. And then you've also got Focus, which is yet another great option for your lock slot. This one lets you target non-adjacent units on orb positions and last the entire adventure. So normally, Polaris is a melee fighter, but if you have this face up in your locked slot, then that means that Polaris is able to target any baddie that's on an orb, which means that she has some distance power if she can place orbs far away from her that will still let her damage baddies across the board. So this is very, very powerful when deployed well. And that is the lovely Healing Aura. Kind of on the opposite end of that, we have Negative Vibes, which is die number 12. So even Polaris, she's positive, but she can have some negative vibes. So it's usually going to get a bones face. You can get Radiation, which lets you place a poison 2 effect die on each unit on an orb position. So you can just do some widespread poisoning of anybody that's standing on one. Note that this die says unit and not baddie or Gearloc, which means that if you have both enemies and allies on orb positions, you're poisoning all of them, so be careful. And then you have the delightful Trepanation. And this will let you deal a number of damage to each unit on an orb position that is printed on the die face. So some of the Trepanation faces will have 1 damage and some will have 2. There's also a face on this die that stands for misalignment. So think going to the chiropractor and it goes bad. At least I'm assuming that's what that ribcage means. But with this one, you place a weaken 2 effect die on each unit on an orb position. And what weaken does is it reduces the unit's attack stat by that number on its next turn. So essentially, if you put a weaken 2 on the Orc Rager, that would decrease his attack stat by 2 and leave him in a position where he can't do anything on his next turn in terms of attack. And you also get another shot at Focus, which is that locked die face that lets you target anybody that is on an orb position instead of just having to fight baddies that are adjacent to you. So that's Negative Vibes. We also have Natural Empath, which has got some nice bones faces, but it also does something very interesting, which is that it has this lovely little symbol of a bleeding heart with, I guess, some thorns around it. Yikes. But it lets you transfer a status effect die from yourself or a unit on an orb position to any other unit on an orb position. And you can place this in an active slot. So you can kind of save this for later. And then let's say that you get poisoned and you don't want to be poisoned, obviously. You could choose to transfer your poison die to anybody else that's on an orb position. So if Polaris is currently poisoned, but she has an orb that's right here, we could use the Empath face from either an active slot, or we could roll it and use it immediately to transfer this to somebody who's on an orb position. Oops, I guess you can enjoy feeling my feelings now, baddie. So that's natural Empath, which is super cool once you figure out how to use it. We've also got Orb Apothecary. So let's see what that one does. So of course it's going to have a few bones faces. So of course it's going to have a face with bones on it. But the others are very, very interesting. Here we have a jagged orb, and the die face looks exactly like a jagged orb, so I'm good with it. This one lets you choose one orb that's being recalled, and then any unit that orb would damage instead gains a bleed effect die. And I want to note that this die alone cannot cause a recall. Instead, you exhaust it and use it in conjunction with a recall that you started either by using your backup plan or by using a skill from a different die. So if we're going to play this die, an orb is being recalled, it comes back to Polaris, goes in her supply, and it went through these two baddies who will each get a bleed effect die placed on them. Orb Apothecary also has a face that stands for Armor Piercing Orb, and again, this can be used immediately or placed in an active slot. When you play this one, you choose one orb that's being recalled, and then any damage that it does is true damage. So it just makes it hurt that little bit more. So that is Orb Apothecary. And then we have kind of the centerpiece, right, of this entire profession, which is Orbital Strike. You're of course going to get one bones face on this die, but it does a lot of other stuff. So this die face stands for Instant Recall. It's an immediate use die face, and you choose any baddie, and you recall the orb that's closest to the baddie's position. So you recall an orb to a baddie instead of to Polaris. But then the orb deals 1 damage to each unit it touches. So if you can recall an orb to a baddie that touches a lot of other baddies, this is very, very useful in damaging. Again, it's unit, not baddie, so be very careful because you can hurt your friends this way. You've also got Precision Recall, and this lets you recall up to the number of orbs that are printed on the die to any baddie's position. Each orb deals damage to that baddie equal to the number of unoccupied positions it touches. So what do we mean when we say that we're doing precision recall? Basically what will happen is, let's say that we have an orb here corresponding with this spot and an orb here corresponding with this position. What that'll mean is that if we do precision recall for 2 and we choose to recall both orbs, we can recall them to any baddie's position. So let's say that we want to recall them to this position and mess with the Orc Rager. What that means is that we recall them to his position and we deal damage to him equal to the number of unoccupied positions each orb touches. So this orb starts in an unoccupied position, it travels through one more, and it comes to this baddie. I mean, we could go through an occupied position, but why? We're trying to do damage. So to go 1, 2, and hit this baddie for 2, and be recalled. This orb starts in 1, goes through another one, and then goes in to touch this baddie for another 2 damage, for a total of 4 damage from this precision recall. Because it's about how many unoccupied positions the orb touches, including the one that it starts in and the ones that it passes through. So that is Orbital Strike. When you strike at the right moment, it's fantastic. Next, let's go ahead and talk about Polaris's movement coach profession. You start here in the middle with Polarity Switch, and then you can go up to Magnetizer or down to Scrambler. So let's go ahead and do Polarity Switch first, because that's the skill die that you have to start with if you're going to train this profession up. So Polarity Switch, of course, has a bones face on it, but it's also got these interesting faces that have a lever on them, and these can be paired with a 2, a 3, or a 4 in the top right-hand corner. So what this lever stands for is repolarization. It's an instant use die face, and it lets you move yourself up to the number of positions printed on the die. So again, 2, 3, or 4 positions. And you may pass through occupied positions. So it's kind of like an amazing little teleport effect. So for example, if Polaris rolled this, then I could move up to 3 positions. I could go 1, 2, 3 and just blitz right through these baddies and show up on the other side. Or I could go 1, 2, 3, basically whatever I wanted to do, but this is giving me the ability to transport myself to any available position within 3 of me, even if that means I would have to pass through an occupied space. So that is pretty stunning. And then the final face that you get on here stands for Electromagnet. and this one has a 4 printed in the top right. You move yourself and or your orbs up to a total of the number of positions printed on the top right corner of that die face. And again, you may pass through occupied positions. So this die face lets you just move yourself a certain number of spaces, but the electromagnet face lets you move yourself and your orbs in combination up to the number of positions printed on the die, which is also pretty amazing. So that is Polarity Switch. And then Polarity Switch can take you to Magnetizer or Scrambler. So let's go to Magnetizer first. The Magnetizer die has no bones faces, but it does have 3 faces with this symbol that stand for personal magnetism. This lets you place yourself adjacent to any orb position, or to place an already deployed orb on a position adjacent to you. Also, if the iron orb die is currently exhausted and you use this face, then you unexhaust that die, so you can roll it again and use its abilities and get another orb out, which is very cool. You also have 3 more of these electromagnet faces that let you move yourself and your orbs in combo up to the number of positions printed on the die. So this one offers you the chance to move 4, 5, or 6 positions. But just to demo personal magnetism very quickly, basically if I have an orb that is here in this position, I can place myself adjacent to any orb position. So I can go here, because this is an orb position, or I can go here, and I would still be adjacent to that orb position. Alternatively, if I wanted to move an orb closer to me, I could take this orb that's been deployed and move it here or here. So it basically lets me rearrange myself and my orbs. And also, if Iron Orb had already been exhausted this battle, then I could unexhaust it, put it back in my skill mat, ready for some more action. So that is Magnetizer. And we've also got one more die in this profession called Scrambler. So Scrambler once again has a bones face, but then it also has several more faces that have this symbol with either a 1 or a 5 in the bottom right corner. And what this one allows you to do is place yourself on any orb position, and then you can place a stun effect on an adjacent baddie that is worth this number or fewer baddie points. So this one has a 5 on it. I could stun a 5-point or less baddie. So let's say that I rolled it. Let's say that there is an orb here. I can essentially use this die to teleport over to this orb position. So I'm actually going in the orb position. And then I can place a stun effect die on the bridge troll. Boom. And that would essentially stun him and cause him to miss his next turn, which is pretty awesome. So that is Scrambler. And you can in fact scramble the brains of some baddies if you use it. So before we go into the mineralist profession, I do also want to talk about Polaris's consumables. So her first one is called Extra Orb, and that's exactly what you think it is. It's a die that lets you deploy that extra yellow orb. And it also does a couple of other things, which is very cool. So technically this die face is named Rare Alloy. Basically when you use it, you deploy an orb that is 2 positions away from you, and then you deal the number of damage printed on the die to the unit on that position. Then you can place this die, see how it's got a little bones face on it as well, in your backup plan as bones. So it lets you place an orb, potentially do damage depending on whether the orb is placed on an occupied position, and then you get to put it in your backup plan. So it's very, very handy. So again, this side would let you place an orb, your yellow orb specifically, 2 positions away. You do 1 damage, and then you put this in your backup plan. So just to show it off on the mat, let's say that we are using this die. So basically we can place this orb up to 2 positions away. Let's say we want to put it on the Orc Rager. So we'll put it right here. That will deal 1 damage to him because it says 1 on the die. And then the die goes in the backup plan. So that is how you use Extra Orb. We've also got Seeking Stones, which is a counter. This is a counter that starts at 0 and it goes up to 3. And basically when you use Seeking Stones, you decrease it by 1 during Resolve Your Roll. And that lets you re-roll an unused Orb Sage die that you rolled this turn. So if I wanted to roll 1 or more of these on my turn, and I didn't like the face I got, maybe I wanted to try again, I could decrease Seeking Stones by 1 and then re-roll that die. Alternatively, this will give me an additional re-roll of all of my dice during a delve. And we are about to talk about what that means. But before we do that, just one reminder, there are only 2 ways to increase the count on Seeking Stones. One is Gather Stones in the backup plan, which we'll hit again when we talk about the backup plan. The other is to use a Fortunate Discovery loot card, which will let you set this counter to full. So I think it is now time to talk about delving and about Polaris's mineralist profession. And the reason I saved this for last is because it's not something that Polaris does during battle. So you have an extra little sheet that's going to help you with what the dice do. But essentially the concept of delving is that after each recovery phase, Polaris has an option to do what's called delving. And this doesn't take the place of any of her other recovery options. This is something that is an extra that she is allowed to do. And the dice that are in the mineralist profession are the dice that she uses to delve. So before delving, Polaris might have dice in her active slots. She can remove any of those dice. And then any of the delve dice that aren't currently in her active slots, she must roll. And then after rolling, Polaris can either choose to keep the rolled result, or if she has rerolls, she has the option to reroll all of them. So there is a limit on the number of rerolls that Polaris can take, and that includes the initial roll. So her number of rolls that she has is equal to the number of delve dice that she has trained. So if you have just one delve die, you really, at the base of it, can just roll it once. If you have delve and deep delve, then you have a roll and a reroll, essentially. And if you've got delve, deep delve, and dark delve, you can roll all 3 dice, and then because you've trained all 3 of them, you can re-roll up to 2 more times for a total of 3 rolls. If you want extra re-rolls, that is, of course, the other use of Seeking Stones. If you have Seeking Stones and you can decrease the counter, you can decrease it by 1 to get another re-roll until you run out. But then, once you're out of re-rolls or you decide to stop trying to re-roll, you are stuck resolving all of the results that you get. So some of the delve dice have really awesome results, and some of the delve dice have bad results. And if you end up with some bad results and you can't re-roll your way out of them, you are in fact stuck with them. So let's look at the options for delve, deep delve, and dark delve. And a nice little key, by the way, is again on delve deep with Polaris. So the first die in this profession is delve, and it's pretty chill. A couple of the die faces are just blank, like you didn't find anything on your delve. On a couple of faces, you're going to find a bone. It's too many bones after all, so you can at least get something nice for your backup plan. And the way this works is this die does not go directly into your backup plan. What will happen is that you will put this in your active slots, and then if this die is in your active slot at the start of battle, you exhaust this die, and then you place the number of bones on that face in your backup plan. And you take those bones from the attack/defense dice supply. Here you have natural armor. Again, this goes in your active slot. If this is sitting in your active slots at the start of battle, you exhaust this die and you place a defense number 2 die in your active slots. And this one is salvaged goods. It's an instant. You gain 1 loot. So that is delve. The loot face is instant, but the others, if you get something, would go in your active slot, and then you exhaust them at the start of the next battle and take the goodies. So that is delve. Then you get deep delve, which is more exciting and also perhaps a touch more risky. So again, you're going to get bones faces. You have 1 with 1 bones and then 2 faces with 2. You might roll healing crystals. These are buff HP. This is another active slot die. So if this is the result you get, you put it in your active slot. At the start of the next battle, you exhaust this die and put 2 buff HP in your prep area. Because of course 2 is the number that's printed on the die. Here you have buried treasure. This one lets you gain 1 trove loot or unlock a trove loot in your loot area, which is super convenient. If you get it, it's an instant. So you don't have to store this. It happens right away. And then you've also got a face that stands for Sharp Rocks. Also an instant. Take 2 true damage. You must use this result if it is showing when you resolve your delve. So you would definitely want to have a reroll left if you roll this die result because it's not good. So let's go ahead and put deep delve in its slot and have a look at dark delve. Drums in the deep, everyone. So dark delve has 2 faces with 2 bones, 1 face with 3 bones, another healing crystals face, which again gives you buff HP at the start of battle if this is in an active slot. Personal enrichment, which is one of the things that makes delving entirely worth it, because this gives you 1 training point to immediately spend, and it's amazing. But then you could also get baddie alert. So this just has 1 point. It's not a baddie that's that bad, but even 1 extra 1 point baddie can really throw you in battle. So if you have to resolve this die face, that stands for baddie alert. And it means you draw a 1 point baddie from the active stacks and you place it in your prep area. Then you add that baddie to the bottom of the next baddie queue that is created. And you must use this result if it's showing when you resolve your delve. So that is dark delve. And then I thought it might be kind of fun just to have a sample delve, just to kind of show you how it would work. So let's say that I'm going to roll all 3 of my delve dice, and then I have Seeking Stones at 1, just in case I want another reroll. So I have up to 4 rolls available to me. 1, 2, 3. And if I want to spend Seeking Stones down to 0, 4 rolls. So here's roll number 1. Okay, so maybe I actually kind of like that result. I get 2 bones, 2 buff HP, and 2 defense. And these would all just sit in my active slots until the start of the next battle. But let's say that I'm feeling more ambitious, you know? I have 2 more rerolls left off of just these dice. So that was 1 of my 4 rolls. Let's do it again. 2. All right, so it's not necessarily that exciting. You know, it's okay. Didn't get anything on this face, a bone, some buff HP. I really did better last time. So of course I should roll again. Okay, so this time it was just a whole bunch of bones. And I just gotta do it. I gotta put Seeking Stones down to 0. I'm a gambler. So this is my last reroll, and I have to live with whatever's on these dice. Fortunately, it worked out okay. But I ended up with a whole bunch of bones and some buff HP. So what I'd do is I'd put all of these in my active slots until the next battle. And then at the start of the next battle, I would put this amount of bones in my backup plan, and I would also give myself 2 buff HP to my prep area. If my active slots are all full, then I'll just have to keep whatever I can, but do note that the ones with bad results are instantly resolved, and so you can never avoid sharp rocks or baddie alert. And that is the mineralist profession. So every recovery phase, once you start training these, you get to delve, and it's pretty awesome. So those are all of Polaris's dice. Let's go ahead and talk about her backup plan. Polaris's backup plan breakdown is in the expected place on the back of her reference sheet. So for 1 bone, you can gather stones. And that means you can either increase Seeking Stones by 1 or unexhaust the Iron Orb die. So if you want to place more orbs, you can keep spending bones to unexhaust Iron Orb and keep getting that die back so you can place more orbs. Alternatively, you can increase Seeking Stones by 1 and get that counter up. For 2 bones, you got Minor Recall. Let's let you recall all orbs to your position. Orbs deal 2 damage to each baddie and 1 damage to each party member that they touch. So if I'm having a minor recall, I would pull this orb back to myself along this line, and it would do 2 damage to each of the baddies it passed along the way. But be careful, your friends can be in the way too. For 3 bones, you can do Mag Therapy, which lets you heal for 3 HP, so fortunately Polaris does come with some healing ability. For 4 bones, you can do Major Recall. That lets you again recall all orbs to your position, but this time orbs deal 4 damage to each baddie and 2 to each party member they touch. So it's like Minor Recall, but double it. For 5 bones, you can do Orb Restore. That lets you unexhaust all of your dice in the Orb Sage profession and immediately roll any number of them, and it doesn't cost any dex, which is amazing because it basically lets you get all of your Orb Sage profession dice back, roll them all, use all of their effects as you wish, and also put some more orbs out depending on how many you place. Good stuff. And then of course, for 6 bones, you can upgrade to your innate +1, which is Matchmaker. And that one I think you can appreciate more now that we've gone through this whole video. So when you're using either the minor or major recall backup plans, that means Polaris gets to choose which orbs are recalled instead of recalling all of them. So that means that if a bunch of your orbs would do damage to baddies, but one of your orbs might really hurt some party members, you can choose to leave it in place and not recall it once you have your innate +1, because it gives Polaris control over which orbs she recalls. So her backup plan, as usual, works beautifully with her skills. You've also got a beginner build strat. So this is going to tell you up front, Polaris is especially good with skills in her backup plan, but you do want to get her HP up a little bit higher. It starts at 3. It's good to get it up to about 5. If you're not getting enough damage from your skills, then you might want to add some attack as well because it starts out pretty low. As for skills, Polarity Switch is recommended for early on because it's good for setting up recalls or for getting Polaris out of trouble. And of course, additional orbs increase the amount of damage that you can do with your orb skills, but it also risks hurting other Gearlocs if you're playing co-op. If you're finding that you want to fill out your backup plan some more and Polaris needs more bones, then of course she's got her mineralist profession, but with it comes danger. So that is Polaris. She is a super interesting Gearloc to play once you get used to working with her trajectory board and her orbs. She might seem a little bit spacey with her astrology girl vibes, but trust me, she's very down to earth when it comes to the practical aspects of doing serious damage to baddies. So that is Polaris. I hope you're very excited to take Polaris out for a spin and that you understand her better, and happy gaming.